this work is not unique to CESI. This work is happening across the country and across the world. So without further ado, I will let my panel introduce themselves, and we're just going to loosely talk about a couple of questions. We'll probably won't have too much time for questions afterwards, so I'd encourage you to talk at lunch and keep the discussion moving informally. So I'm delighted to be joined by Mags Amond, Catherine Cronin, Rebecca O'Neill, and Pat Seaver. And just to give you a flavour of, this is the newly launched image that we're really happy to share, so feel free to use it with attribution. So our first question for the panel: in what ways are educators across Ireland facilitating open asynchronous professional development? So maybe if you folks would introduce yourselves and give your take on that question.
Okay, we'll go alphabetical.
Very good.
We had a really good discussion about this. I am Mags Amond, and I am CESI long-term member, and I'm doing a PhD at the moment on TeachMeet, which is open professional development, hence my interest in this. And I would say CESI is quite to the fore in leading open educational asynchronous development, but I'll pass the introductions around before I go on for 3 hours.
Okay. All right, I'm trying to get the alphabetical order right. My name is Catherine Cronin, and I work at the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. Much of my work is in the area of open education. So I love this whole notion of open asynchronous professional development, and obviously this room is all the people who are converted to that because you're here on a Saturday. But yes, I'll talk more and maybe some examples from the National Forum as well, but I'll continue with the introductions.
Yes. O goes next. So I have to run through the alphabet in my head, embarrassingly. So my name is Rebecca O'Neill. I am the project coordinator for Wikimedia Community Ireland, which is the recognised affiliate of the Wikimedia Foundation in Ireland, so the charity behind Wikipedia and all of its sister projects. I suppose from my point of view, my doctorate was in kind of digital curation through digital media, so the idea of people bringing together sources and information on platforms and in ways that were useful to them. And Wikipedia, in particular Wikimedia Commons, can be a host for if you are creating open license content that you want to share with others in I suppose, a very stable and a platform that hopefully will be around for quite a number of years and isn't going to be locked down like Flickr or something like that, is definitely a place that you can safely store some content that you're developing or using. But equally, it gives you a platform to deal with perhaps professionals that are in adjacent roles to you, like librarians or information professionals, that kind of thing.
Excuse me, can I suggest maybe that people use the microphone?
Do we need to get...
We might be missing some of the...
Is it very... Okay,
or
maybe
even
a
maybe
little closer.
just pass between each other.
Okay.
Backing band, 2 and 2. Thanks,
Sorry
Tom.
about that.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, my name is Pat Seaver. I'm obviously alphabetically challenged. I'm a teacher with enthusiasm for IT and education, ICT and education. Probably more enthusiasm than competence, but that's another story. If we talk about asynchronous professional development, my first reaction is, it was ever thus. We have been developing ourselves professionally through snatched conversations in the staff room, over a cup of coffee, over lunches at the organised professional development sessions that we get, conversations over lunch or whatever at events such as this. But the difference now is that we have more platforms, where it's possible, a term that I heard echoed only this morning at breakfast time, finding our tribe. It's the technology is now allowing us to do things and to reach a far greater audience, but also to be able to learn from far more people because of the technology. And that's what makes it different, and that's what makes it, I think, more exciting.
Well, I'm going to jump right in there and shout out for the CESI Asynchronous Professional Development, because I think we have to give a vote of thanks to John Hegarty. About 12 years ago, John took us down the open source path and the Linux path when he set up our new CESI list. He was using the Irish Linux Users Group model. And for me, that's the day that really really valuable asynchronous professional development started for me. I mean, 24/7, I had to tap into the most incredible PD of my life in terms of EdTech anyway. So I don't even think he's in the room, because I think is he here? No, he's just yeah, he's actually still working on his sewing machine somewhere, or he could be dancing. But if you meet him later on, shake his hand.
Thank you, folks. Again, drawing on some of Brian's visuals, and actually taps in nicely to what Mags is talking about with John's work on that mailing list, that we sketched out some of the work that CESI does, but also applicable to the work of, let's say, Wikimedia or to the National Forum, that what does this open asynchronous professional development look like? And I think Pat was touching on that to some degree, but I'd like to open that to the panel, that what does it look like? What does it look like in practice across the country?
I might just give a personal answer and then my National Forum answer. So my personal answer would be, I suppose from 10, 11 years ago, Twitter and EdChat.ie was how I found a lot of the people in this room and found my way to CESI. So I have to give a nod to that. And then the successive waves as your interest, develops into other things and you find Wikimedians and, whatever else you might be interested in. Next week, for example, is Open Education Week. So the hashtag OE Week. You will find a wealth of, webinars and conversations and Twitter chats and all kinds of things if you want to learn a little bit more about open licensing, open educational practices, open pedagogies, whatever. And that's just one example. So for me, as you were saying, finding networks of people who I can learn from and be emboldened by to change my own practice, has just been instrumental. And it's mostly informal and it's open and it's asynchronous. For the last year and a bit, I've been working for the National Forum, and that's at the Twitter hashtag is ForumTL for teaching and learning, and the website is teachingandlearning.ie. And the forum developed something called a professional development framework a few years ago. And all of the resources for that are open. So open.courses on the National Forum website, you can find courses on universal design for learning, teaching online, whatever. And those are small, openly licensed, CC licensed modules that people can do, because the people in the National Forum, and again, this predated me, recognize that accreditation is important, but it's not important for all people, and it's not important for all things. So these kind of small, bite-size bits of learning that you can do in your own time as part of a CPD course with a pal, and the whole notion of openness and open licensing just unlocks that. And means that anybody can access it, across all sectors of education, and anyone who has access to the web. So I can talk more about that, but those are kind of two different things.
From the Wikimedia perspective, and it's a challenge when you talk about kind of the embarrassment of channels that you can have, is actually, yes, your tribe probably exists, but where do you find them? And which channel are they in? And that will be, obviously, there'll be a certain amount of history to that, whether or not somebody is comfortable with mailing lists and are not comfortable with social media postings, or if you have a professional that's just emerged and they're really engaged with TikTok and Snapchat, and they're only going to be talking to peers that are comfortable on certain platforms. And that's something that from the international Wikimedia point of view is quite challenging. We know there's an awful lot of really interesting work going on, but where is it documented and how can I find it? They're not always necessarily logically placed sometimes. It's part of a huge strategy that we've been doing in the Wikimedia Foundation to actually better map and better understand the variety of activity that's happening internationally. And even I know in Ireland there are teachers that are using Wikipedia in the classroom who have never heard of Wikimedia Community Ireland and don't know that the support is there. So there's kind of known unknowns and unknown unknowns when it comes to these things. So I think quite often, when it comes to the role that groups like CESI and the Teaching and Learning Forum can have is also as aggregators and as signposters. So actually saying this is where the conversations are happening. And that has to be quite an active process because it is going to be changing all of the time.
I think that probably segues nicely into the next question.
Can I?
Sorry, Max.
Well, no, credit also has to be given, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years to the, what would I call them, the official channels for professional development in the country have really embraced social media as well. So when I want to go and find out what JCT is doing or PDST, I still go to Twitter and I can find it on their timeline. So, okay, they have to provide synchronous, correctly checked professional development, but it's really good to see them embrace the channels to find teachers and draw us in.
Thank you, Mags. So as we come back to the actual conference theme and looking at our evolving landscape of learning, in terms of open asynchronous professional development, I just wanted to get the panel's reaction that how they see that landscape of what you're discussing really in the last question. How do we see it evolving past 2020? What developments do you see on the horizon?
Well, I think that Rebecca touched on it just a few minutes ago. We're probably going from one extreme where there were absolutely no outlets maybe 20 years ago for a teacher or an enthusiast within a school to find like-minded souls. Now we have the opposite problem, whereas Rebecca said there is a plethora of channels. There's a multitude of platforms. And I think part of how this landscape will evolve is I don't think we really know yet. I mean, I was talking at the coffee break just about learning platforms, learning management systems. And somebody said, do you remember when Edmodo was going to take over everything? And there's another person who said what? They'd never heard it, that Edmodo had bypassed them completely. So in terms of how the landscape is changing, I don't know what it's going to be. But what I love about the graphic that Brian has there is this whole notion of there's certain obstacles, there's certain things we can see in the distance. We're not quite sure how we're going to get there, but I think we have guiding principles that act like pole stars that will help us navigate whatever way we make it through there. I mean, I'm an optimist, and I think we will continue to develop very, very strong systems. We will have very, very powerful communities. I think in the future, continuous professional development will be asynchronous and it will be continuous. But I have no idea as to what it's going to look like.
It's your job, Catherine. You have to answer this one.
Again, I have a personal reaction first, and the learning from each other. I think it's, we tend to answer in ways that are just the nice ways. Oh, it's great, I was able to learn about this, or I learned about another educator doing that. But sometimes learning is uncomfortable, and I think when it's open and asynchronous and global, we can face up to some of what makes us uncomfortable. So, dominant knowledge structures in society are gendered. There tend to be white, male, Western voices in our history textbooks and in the newspapers and on the web and so on. And being parts of networks where we can engage with people and stories that are often on the margins is really powerful. So even just on this panel this morning, a term that I used until about a year ago was find my tribe. I thought that was, it speaks to me. And I learned through my networks that, Indigenous people or Indigenous rights find that appropriates a word that is very significant for them. So I don't use that anymore. And we can think of lots of examples of that. And it doesn't come from badness. I mean, as I said, I did it until a year ago myself. So I think the notion of learning from each other and being open can often expose some things that make us uncomfortable, but that's really powerful learning. And then when we share that with our peers and our students, we can kind of extend that. So that's the first thing that strikes me about that, and I don't think that we should forget that. The nice stories are wonderful, but being able to face up to our own gendered, racist, colonialist sometimes patterns of how we were educated and raised ourselves, and kind of unearth some of those, and really ideas that don't serve us anymore is part of what open asynchronous professional development can help us to do.
I might add one more flag to that picture that Brian has drawn, because I think with the growth and the validation of things like the CESI list, Wikipedia now, I think there's something for everybody on the right, but also something from everybody, that our professional development, as we move on, I have something to offer everyone in this room, but everybody else has as well. And the asynchronous model of going into a platform and browsing and looking and seeing, you will get something from everybody. It's a two-way street, that for everything you get, the more you get, you hopefully will tend to give a little bit back. So one up for your platform, Rebecca, and I'll let you have the next word.
Right. Getting a lot of love today, which is unusual sometimes in a room. The thing that I would add to this is that I know there's an awful lot in the Wikimedia contents, but also across all teaching, is that there's really interesting projects being done, but quite often the energy that sustains those projects, the kind of the extracurricular stuff that goes into it, it doesn't get sustained into documentation and dissemination. So the stuff is happening. It's really, cutting edge. It's really exciting. It's really engaging, but nobody else knows about it because by the time you've gotten to the end of it, you don't have the energy to let other people know about it. So it's one of the things with the Wikimedia Foundation is actually documentation and ease of discoverability are the two main issues that we have. And I think within this we have to make space for either providing the capacities for people or giving them aids for documentation or ease of platform or tools, toolkits that they can work with. But I think enabling people to have the time and the space and the capacity to document their failings as well as their successes, I think is very important and very powerful within this space.
Thank you, folks. And I'm just realizing as I stand up here, I kind of wish I didn't volunteer to chair it because I could be taking notes or tweeting all these great ideas. And now I'm just thinking about racing to lunch and jotting down a few ideas myself because that's the joy of having to be the MC. Because we're actually keeping to time, we're quite proud of ourselves today. Are there any final thoughts from our panelists, or would anyone like to take a question? Again, keeping this as a nice informal panel discussion. Are there any final thoughts maybe first, or questions? Final thoughts? Yes, please. I have a wireless mic. I can deliver it to you.
Well, I was going to say, I see several people here who are teacher trainers who are working in the initial teacher training area, and I love what's happening now in a lot of those areas. You are now teaching your baby teachers before they come out into the real world to be in charge of their own professional development. Have you got any ideas or thoughts or anything? I'm looking at several people in particular, but won't name anybody. Just wondering how you're feeling about teaching them about the future of their professional development before they enter the profession formally, if they get a job.
Yeah. I can see the blockchain music is starting to try to drown us out, so let's compete.
I think we have to, excuse me, I just have a small cold. I haven't been in Northern Italy and I haven't been on a train or I haven't been on a plane. But just letting you know I'm fine. It's just your average cold. So excuse me for starting off with this sore throat kind of thing. Well, firstly, I think there's a really significant issue happening to us, and that is that education is changing in rapid areas all of the time. And I'm looking particularly at the early childhood educators in Ireland. I'm looking particularly at how they lay the foundations for the children that come into us in primary and then on to post-primary and then in tertiary education. And one of the things I think which is quite important is that we value them for what they bring to us in the first instance. When we write programs, or when we begin to write programs for teacher ITE, we know what the system needs, or we think we do. But actually, because of its rapid changing nature, future-proofing education for initial teacher education is a very difficult thing. And I think sometimes what we are not doing is we rely too much on the old ways, on the old things that we've done. And I think one of the challenges for me in writing a Level 8 early childhood programme was that who are these teachers of the future? Because it's not me today, it's the teacher of the future. And bringing them to an understanding that they are in charge of their own learning, by means of communicating with others, with parents, means that we have to have less of maybe developmental approach to what's happening and more of a sociological approach, more of a, this is about relationships. This is more, it's not about the functionality of something, it is actually about the relationship that we are building as educators together. And so I hope that helps somewhat.
It's all relational.
You can answer, you know, or
No, I think
You've put your finger on it. It's all relational.
oh, come on, John. Oh, come on, John. He purposely waited for me to do that.
This is another man whose fault it all is. He got us all on Twitter 10 years ago.
It's actually about Twitter I want to talk about. Should we make it mandatory for teachers to have a Twitter account? To kind of engage with, I'm just trying as a question to get started here, but one of the things that myself and Darren had talked about before is that when you have a model of professional development that's very school-based, where circular coaches, LTIs, that learning happens in conversations the whole time. We don't have that model here, but we need to come up with a way that we can digitally connect people. Because if you're a teacher in a small two-teacher school in North Mayo, you're not going to meet many teachers apart from the person at the other end of the corridor. And unless that person is really engaged with technology online, the conversations you're having are going to be about sick kids and puking puppies in the corridor, in the schoolyard. We need to connect people. People probably have to be motivated to kind of connect, whether or not we can kind of intensify, kind of to motivate them to kind of use technology is a hard part to do, but we need to kind of come up with a way of doing it, because if they're happy enough to kind of sit in their own classroom and not be willing to get outside those walls, there's not a whole lot the outside world is going to do to get inside those walls.
So I want to add a little bit to what John just said. I think overall, especially if you're thinking of a teacher who's coming straight out of college, to get them to think about how when they're starting something new, not to go it alone, right? If you're going to try and start a fire and you have one single spark landing in a place where there's no fuel, nothing's going to happen except for that spark's going to die. And so that person could be an instructional coach, it could be an LTI, it could also be another teacher, right? And if you have that small community that is your physical community where you go to work, maybe you can reach out through Twitter and find somebody who you can partner with and swap stories, war stories, you know, stories of success, and getting those students who are coming out and going in as new teachers to understand that they don't have to feel alone, even if they're going into some place that is tiny.
Okay, could I just say one quick response, because I don't know how much time we have left. I concur entirely with you, Darren, that we need to have communities built, we need to encourage. My primary concern is that top-down systems like forcing people to use a particular platform or a particular technology, no matter how much we like it and we think it's great. I think if we have an evolving landscape, we have to let it evolve, and we have to let whichever platforms, whichever modes of communication bubble to the top to allow them to flourish, rather than trying to force people to use one platform, one type of technology, rather than another. That'd be my philosophy, at least.
Okay, I had two ladies waiting for questions. We did start 2 or 3 minutes late, so I think we have enough time to navigate that.
Hi, my name is Anya. I'm a student teacher. I'm just wondering, why Twitter? I don't know anybody on Twitter myself. I'm not on Twitter.
10 years ago, 128 characters was the limit.
Right.
So it had to be short and sweet, and
But
it
that's
was
not the
really,
case now.
really, it was like bite-sized. But it was the global thing. Through a hashtag, I could maybe converse with a teacher in Florida over something we were both interested in. It was the brevity and the immediacy of it, to me, was quite...
So that was 10 years ago?
Yes,
What
I know,
about now?
I know. Now it's gone to 280. Now it's getting a bit, it's getting a bit woolly, and I may rethink what I'm doing. But the hashtag is still, it's the hashtag-driven thing that's
But why
great,
not
Anya.
Instagram or Facebook?
Say again.
Why not Instagram or Facebook?
Well, I would use Insta and I would not use Facebook. So it's. I think it's a very personal thing. That's why I worry about John's idea of making it mandatory. I think it has to be personal. It has to be your context.
But like, say me, no, I'm not on Twitter.
Okay,
None
so
of my friends are, and
I'll find you on Insta then. If hopefully later on.
yeah. And is Instagram and Twitter being used by?
And I don't know about Snapchat. I don't know if that's come or gone.
No,
Yeah.
students.
We meet on TikTok later.
Well, yeah,
I
was
rest
gonna-
my case, Your Honour.
Yeah, well, I was.
Comes in waves.
Aside from Insta, like what other, and I feel so incongruous saying Insta,
I know.
and I'm 35. Like, oh, it's painful. Yeah. Mailing lists. So where would, if you were looking for a community of
I'd look
peers?
on Facebook or Instagram. I wouldn't go near Twitter. I don't know.
That's
No.
interesting because most people I know of my age would consider that nobody under the age of, 25 is on Facebook anymore or is really engaging with it. So
Okay.
there's obviously...
Well, my age group are engaging
Yeah.
in Facebook,
Okay.
and I'm over the age of 25. So
But
far
I
younger.
think that's a great question. I mean, I would always start those conversations in asking, where are the conversations that you want to be a part of?
yeah.
And
Like
then
if I want to be a part of a certain conversation, it means I have to join Twitter, and I'm only joining it just to be a part of the conversation. I'm not joining it for any other reason, so I
that-
wouldn't go on it regularly then. So
that's the question. And then for ourselves and our peers and our students, helping people to just assess the various platforms and where those conversations are happening, thinking about digital identity and not whether you want to be on those platforms, but how you want to be on those platforms, how visible, how active, and so on. And that's really the kind of digital literacies that are more important than being on Twitter or being on X or being on Y. So, but great questions, and would love to chat after.
thank you for the response.
What's new?
Devil's advocate.
Really quick. I'll be really quick. I just think it's very important that you take a step back and not even talk about platforms and just talk about the people. And I think it's no coincidence that the type of people who are involved in CESI are also the type of people who engage in open conversation, informal CPD, the chat at the, over a cuppa in the staff room. And that's how you start this conversation. You're speaking about initial teacher education. That's where we should start. And remind people around us that we're not afraid to make mistakes, and that trialing things is the first step, and subtly introducing change is the best way forward for us. Making content or approaches mandatory, it's something I'm very wary of. Just conversations, being open, sharing practice. It's exactly what Teach Meet, for example, is all about. That open sharing, we all benefit from it. Wikipedia is no different. Providing these platforms, but maybe starting with a conversation. And that's where we need to begin. We're all here and we're all going to be on those platforms, but it's the people who aren't on the platforms who aren't here that we need to really be worried about and be concerned about today. So that's where we need to take this conversation.
Thanks very much, Ciara. I am conscious that it's about 1:05. Were there any burning questions, Brian? Sorry, simplest way to do this.
To be honest, I'd like to just reinforce the last speaker's opinion on this, because I go to a lot of these events, I hear people talking about gee whiz technology, about sophisticated pedagogies, and even ethics. When in actual fact, I think I've spent the last 20 years trying to convince people teaching just to get up onto the first rung of the ladder. Avoided sophisticated technologies, avoided sophisticated pedagogies. Let's just do this in the simplest way possible, get started. And really, it was said it was about people. I suppose it's about culture, really. It's about changing. I just feel that that's where we should be putting our efforts in, is changing the culture, changing the attitude, everybody's attitude towards using technology. And I just don't feel we make progress once we start talking, debating whether it's Twitter or Facebook or things like that, or even sophisticated pedagogies, I'm afraid, as well, you know, that basically if we could do simple things using technology, we can make a lot of progress. So we need to change how people think about them.
Thanks very much, Brian. I'm just conscious of the time because we're eating into lunch. Are there burning questions or?
No, it was just a comment as well.
Okay, and I'd like, for the live stream, you have to use the microphone, sorry, and for accessibility purposes.
No, I suppose where is it all going is one of the questions, and then the idea of asynchronous and synchronous. I suppose recently I've completed two MOOCs. One was a data analytics MOOC on education data analytics, and that was asynchronous. And it was all about sort of harvesting data from different platforms and so on. But it was asynchronous and it wasn't engaging. While on the other hand, I also was working, it wasn't a MOOC, but something quite similar, on mindfulness for a Spanish community. And there it was asynchronous and it was also synchronous insofar as that we had WhatsApp and we also had a video conference once or twice a week. And to compare the two, I mean, on one hand, the education data analytics is it's a new course, a 100-hour course involving a lot of educational technologists, people that are creating online content and so on. I was expecting them to produce something a lot more dynamic, and they didn't. I mean, forums were kind of optional, and at the end it was just doing assessment. It was like a 4-hour assessment, whereas the other one is much, much more dynamic. So in the future, I could see more and more, we spoke about diversity earlier on, the idea of reaching out to more people, but and reaching out to more people in different places that might want to sit in Connemara doing a master's in Harvard or wherever, and that the content then, or if use the word content, the engagement is dynamic, and that for me is an important direction to go. And I know that in creating engaging content is expensive, and sometimes I see, in the case of the data analytics course, I see a focus on data analytics, but not so much on engagement.
Just have a very quick response to that, is that quite often, in my experience, the people who are attempting to maybe engage with these learning platforms, they, and maybe not, forums are optional, other outlets are optional. Quite often they're quite strained when it comes to time and capacity anyway. We see this all the time in the Wikimedia Foundation. They're always trying to run little Google Hangouts that are, show and tell and things like that. And they're trying to make it as international as possible, but for me it's usually at 8 o'clock at night, and I've just done 7 hours of Wikimedia stuff, and I don't want to spend my evening listening, as interesting as it might be to see what somebody's doing in India. I've kind of reached my level for the day. So I think there has to be a certain amount of, I suppose, compassion within that as well, that, you have to understand that while people are very engaged and very motivated, that drawing people to waypoints within, synchronized learning outputs or congregations, you do have to realize that it's kind of within a landscape they're probably quite stretched anyway. And there's no good answer to it, unfortunately.
And I believe on that note, there are no simple answers. And I hate to plug for social media because I'm not a social media evangelist, but if you want to continue the conversation, 8:30 to 9:30 on Monday night is EdChat.ie, and we do meet on Twitter to have these discussions in the open. And for some of us, I know we wouldn't know each other or be part of this community without that. So it's really powerful in that respect. And I do not want to keep you from lunch anymore, so I appreciate your time, and I want to thank my panelists very, very much for their time and for their effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate.